you guys? The Curious Owl here, and today I will be reviewing Supernova by Marissa Meyer, the third and final book in the Renegades trilogy. So like I said, this is the third and final book in this trilogy, so I do have review videos for the other two books in the series, and I'm going to say right off the bat too that this is going to be a spoiler-filled review for Supernova, or as many spoilers as I can really think of as I'm going through my notes for this book, because I have read the other two books in the series, and this is the final one. So if you have not read this series, and especially if you have not read Supernova, I would highly suggest you do so before watching this review, because there's going to be some stuff, especially about the ending, that's going to be revealed. I just would really hate for those of you that would like to read this series to be spoiled for this if you were looking to read this yourself. So please make sure that you've read this before watching this video. With that being said, let's go into the synopsis of the entire story. And because I don't want to hold this up the entire time, I'm going to just use the picture. So I'm going to read the synopsis that there is on Goodreads, because it's going to be the easiest way for me to kind of talk about specifically what this book is about. The synopsis from Goodreads says that this is the epic conclusion to Marissa Meyer's thrilling Renegades trilogy. It finds Nova and Adrian fighting to keep their identity secret. While the battle rages on between their alter egos and their allies, there is a darker threat shrouding Gatlin City. The Renegades' worst enemy is back among them, threatening to reclaim Gatlin City. Nova and Adrian must brave lies and betrayal to protect those they love. Their greatest fears are about to come to life, and unless they can bridge the divide between heroes and villains, they stand to lose everything, including each other. And basically, I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. Like, this is probably the best ending to this series I could have asked for, because I was really concerned with reading this that everything was going to turn out poorly, that characters were not going to end up having the kinds of endings I would have wished. And don't get me wrong, I was devastated by what happened in this book, but I was really happy to see overall how it did end. So let's get into the likes that I have for this. There's quite a few of them. First of all, from page 1, action-packed, intrigue there. Everything was super interesting, because this is piggybacking off of the events of Arch Enemies, where at the end of Arch Enemies, we find out a lot of things. First of all, Nova's uncle, Ace Anarchy, the creator of the Anarchist Age, the man that was taken down by Captain Chromium and all of the other superheroes, was arrested. And he's being put to execution with the product Agent N that was being revealed in Arch Enemies, that basically is going to eliminate his powers, but they were also just going to outright kill him. They weren't just going to get rid of his powers, they were going to full out kill him because of how dangerous he was. So there's a lot of issues on Nova's side surrounding around that, and then later on you find out that her identity gets accidentally revealed, because in Arch Enemies we learned that Dana, one of the people that was on her team in the Renegades, figures out that Nova is Nightmare and tries to get her arrested. And she does get arrested, but then later on we see her name become cleared when somebody else assumes her identity, and kind of goes from there. Not necessarily something I was expecting to happen, because mind you, that happened within the first quarter of this book. And I would say it took about a quarter of the next part of the book to not only have her name cleared, but then also figure out other things that were going to be going on, namely which is Adrian having to figure out how he's going to reveal his identity as the Sentinel to other people. And what was so funny was that while some of these things were kind of things I expected to happen in this book, the reveal of Nova's identity, the reveal of Adrian's, the fact that there was going to be a lot of animosity between the two of them because their superhero alter egos are arch enemies, I wasn't disappointed that those things came up. If anything, I was really happy to know that those things did come up, because they were things I was expecting, and I think they were done super well. But with that being said, while I did expect some things to happen, Marissa Meyer took other things and just ran with them that I did not expect to happen. First of which being the fact that Nova's name gets cleared by Narcissa, who we haven't seen really since book 1, Renegades, because Narcissa was the granddaughter of the librarian that had his library burned to shreds in book 1. And so she had somehow escaped, but we didn't know if we were ever going to see her again. And she comes in this one assuming Nightmare's identity so that Nova's name could be cleared and get her out of prison, so then they could figure out how to release Ace Anarchy from prison. It was just so interesting to see how that whole thing came about. And then on top of that, how the Renegades team was fooled. I was just so excited to see all the twists and turns that came around in this book, because I was left on my toes. I didn't know what to expect after a certain point, and everything that came around, I was really excited to see how that would then continue and further the plot. So in terms of the overall ending of the book, I actually really enjoyed it. I feel like it didn't feel cheap, but it also was a fairly happy ending. But even though things ended up being happy, it didn't come without hardship. We still had a lot of characters who ultimately died, and some of them were really devastating. There was quite a few deaths that I was surprised to see happen, that it honestly felt like I was reliving watching Marvel's Infinity War. Like, it was that level of chaos and destruction and death and all kinds of other things. Because part of what happens by the end of it is that Max, who in Arch Enemies we knew was in the hospital, and over the course of this book heals and everything and he's fine, by the end of this book, he ends up actually taking the powers of several people unwittingly. Because Max has had this ability his whole life. He's part of the reason why Ace Anarchy was defeated 10 years before, by stealing his powers. And in the course of the final battle scene that happens, he steals everybody's powers. Adrian's, Nova's, Captain Chromium's, everyone's powers are just sucked into this poor little kid. And what was so interesting was that overall what ended up happening from there was that Nova ended up actually being able to work with him to release that built up power, because he built up so much, having accrued so much in a very short amount of time, that he was basically going to explode. And so she ended up being able to help him release that, which then gave everybody their powers back. And even people who never had powers in the first place got abilities as well, which was so interesting. And it played into another aspect that we learned about when it came to how prodigies came around, because it was revealed in this book that prodigies actually had obtained their powers due to essentially a planetary radiation of sorts. There was basically like a star or asteroid of some kind that had fallen to Earth, and the radiation that had come off of it had imbued some people with different abilities, which were the prodigies. And then, you know, the prodigies split up between the anarchists and then what would become the renegades. And there were a lot of people who were normal humans, had never had powers because they didn't have that ability imbued into them from that event. But when Max was actually able to release his power that he had built up, everybody, except for him, had powers. And that was such a really sweet thing, because Max had led his entire life up to that point having to be quarantined from other people to keep him from taking on their powers, because it was something he couldn't help, something he couldn't actually stop from happening. And so at the end of this, to see him not only lose all of his powers, but then also no longer able to take on everybody else's powers, it was such a relief for me as the reader, because I finally felt like that this kid could finally have a normal life. Another thing I really enjoyed, going into specifically the character progression. So I have always adored Nova. Nova Artino has always been one of my most favorite characters. But I really think in this book we see the strength of her will and her inability to make a decision of who to really fight for be tested here. Because in this book, not only do we see her having to figure out how to save her uncle, but over the course of this, we also see other things that have been kind of building up ever since the first book come to finally a head. For instance, at the very end of this book, the one thing that we learn that changes the entire course of things in this story is exactly who sent the people to kill Nova's family 10 years before, when she was a child, that resulted in the death of her mother, her father, and her baby sister, Evie. And unshockingly to me, but still very satisfying to have this be the conclusion of why exactly they were killed, we do find out that Uncle Ace actually was the one that sent people to kill his own brother and sister-in-law and niece, because of the fact that his brother was siding with the Renegades. and the fact that his brother was trying to undermine him. So safe to say, Nova was pretty pissed about that. But honestly, even up to that point, we saw Nova over the course of this in vast, very lengthy discussions with Captain Chromium, Adrian's father, about the issues that there are within the Renegades, exposing a lot of the hypocrisy that there is in terms of things like Agent N and the execution that was going on, and the fact that she was arrested without due process, all up until the reveal of what actually happened to her family and the fact that Ace was behind all of it. Nova, I think, really showed how middle of the road things were for her. Because yes, she did believe that the anarchists were being treated unfairly, and I think it was very clear that that was the case. But it also was very important to understand that there were a lot of anarchists back in the day who were incredibly dangerous and do deserve punishment. But it was very interesting to see Nova kind of play with that idea of being the devil's advocate in a sense, but speaking to her truth and understanding that she comes from a place of just wanting to be accepted and just wanting to be listened to when nobody else seems to want to listen to her. And it was so hard for me to figure out exactly how I wanted Nova to go in terms of what side to be on, because it was too close of a call for me. It didn't seem right for her to completely side with the Renegades because of all the hypocrisy and injustice that they have done in the name of justice. And then it also wasn't really great for her to side with the anarchists because they were doing really bad stuff in retaliation of the things that they experienced at the hands of the Renegades. I think that really showcases the fact that Marissa Meyer is very aware of how, especially in our world, there is this very black and white thinking of what is good and what is bad, but nobody thinks about the idea of there being this kind of double-edged sword of living life where there are people, especially in governmental positions, who will attack those that are not following their rules and their regulations, and yet they are not doing the same thing, or they are doing even worse things than what those people that they are targeting are doing. In terms of other characters, Oscar and Ruby are still some of my most favorite side characters ever, and they're my favorite side character couple, because what we learn in Arch Enemies is Oscar is trying to tell Ruby that he loves her and that he wants to be with her, and this entire time that we see him trying to figure things out in the midst of all the chaos was a little bit of a nice reprieve, because he was trying to be fun and goofy and not try too hard, but he was trying very hard, and eventually, when it came to it, things went great because Oscar's adorable and Ruby's known that and she loves him. And while it was super sweet, there were some really cringy moments, but those cringy moments just made me love it even more because it was so stinking adorable. Now, in terms of Adrian, one of my favorite romantic characters I've ever come across. The man I hold every other male character up against had so much riding in on this story because his identity has always been, from book one, something he cherishes as the Sentinel. It is something that he has used as not only his metaphorical armor against the world, but his actual physical armor in order for him to actually be able to fight with the Renegades, because he had spent so much of his life being told that he couldn't really fight against these other people because he wasn't strong enough. And the only thing he could do was his ability, which was draw. But what I really love about this is the fact that even when his identity was revealed, there was understanding on his parents' part. Both Captain Chromium and the Dread Warden understood that he had more capability than they had originally thought. And I think they understood that something was bound to happen eventually. And it was something that I think was also hard for them to come to terms with, because he is a grown man now. Adrian is like a young adult. He's 17, 18 years old. He's capable of making his own decisions. And for them, having raised him from a young child was probably very hard for Captain Chromium and the Dread Warden to see this young man they raised be at a point where he can now stand up for himself. He can now fight his own battles. And I can't speak on this as a parent because I don't have children, but I can only imagine as a parent having to see your kid grow up and try to protect them for so long from all these awful things that are happening in the world, to then see them grow up and make their own decisions, how hard it must be to let go of that control of that child. And so I think it was really, really amazing to see that the parents were still supportive of him and understood that this was bound to happen, but they weren't necessarily happy about it per se because of the fact that he hid it for so long. But at the same time, when they realized that Adrian was the Sentinel, they were like, it all makes sense now. Now, the next thing in terms of twists and reveals that happened in this book that I was so impressed with, and was probably one of the greatest payoffs in this entire story, is the reveal of what actually happened to Adrian's mother. Because ever since book 1, we have known that Adrian's mother was murdered. We didn't know by who, we didn't know exactly what happened, but we knew that she was murdered when Adrian was young, and then Captain Chromium and the Dread Warden had adopted him and raised him themselves. And in Arch Enemies, we learned a little bit more information in terms of the fact that the puppeteer had known who could have killed Lady Indomitable, but we didn't know how to get that information. And so in this book, Nova finds out over the course of time, and then later Adrian finds out, that when Adrian was very young, when he was first starting to figure out how to draw and was starting to bring drawings in a sense to life metaphorically, where like they were very well done, they were, incredibly detailed, that as time had gone on, Adrian had created this dark, shadowy figure that he was afraid would take his mother away when he was very little. Because growing up with a superhero parent who could die at any moment, very similar to, I would believe, how people today would view, having a parent who was a police officer, a firefighter, somebody in the military, having that overwhelming fear of something happening to them and them not coming back, basically snowballed for Adrian with his drawings. Because then what ended up happening is when Adrian's powers came to fruition as he got older, that character quite literally came off the page and grew into its own person. And that person was Phobia, the most mysterious character in the anarchist realm. In this book, we learned that around the time that Ace Anarchy was brought down, and also the same day that Lady Indomitable was killed, Phobia just appeared out of nowhere. And also on that same day was the day that Nova's parents were killed, which was why nobody came to save her and her family when Ace had sent the people to murder her family. So everything in this one reveal tied everything together. Phobia was created by Adrian unintentionally, and instilled inside him was this need to kill Lady Indomitable because it was Adrian's greatest fear, and Phobia has the ability to play on people's fears and bring them to life in order to battle against them. So he goes and he kills Lady Indomitable by literally scaring her to death with her own fear, which was the fact that her son would be killed. So she quite literally has a heart attack from being scared to death and dies. When Lady Indomitable was killed, she was on the way to try to save Nova's family from Ace Anarchy's henchmen. Everything tied together so well. I didn't feel like there was anything that I was questioning, that I was really not understanding. I just, by the end of this, felt like I understood everything, and light bulbs went off in my head. Quite honestly, with everything nice I've had to say about this, the one thing I didn't like, but it's because it hurt like hell to read, was all of the deaths that felt very much like Infinity War. That's the only thing. And the only reason I dislike it is because it hurts so much to see these characters get hurt. And that's not even really enough for me to knock anything down from this book, because that was the point of that scene. So, 5 out of 5 stars for Supernova. Really enjoyed it. And one thing too I would like to mention is the fact that in the epilogue of this book, we have the perspective from Magpie. Magpie is a character that we have known since book 1, since the very beginning, who's always kind of been in the shadows. She's kind of been somebody we've only seen in the background a few times and brought up every now and then, but she's a character who is basically, like, she has, like, the tendency to go for shiny objects like a bird does. And she stashes them away all the time. And in this epilogue, she talks about how it's nice that everybody now has powers. It's nice that everybody who lost their powers now has them again. But there always is in every world a place where evil reigns. There is always an aspect where evil will take over. So that was not enough of Magpie for me. I want to know what happens to her further on, because in that epilogue she talks a lot about the idea of needing to survive and basically being at the bottom of the barrel of the people in terms of her abilities and stuff like that. She's got to figure out a way to be able to make ends meet and survive on her own now that everybody seems to have powers, and she's got to watch out for herself. So what I would like to see is, if at all possible, similar to how we got Heartless from the Lunar Chronicles, can we get something with Magpie as like a separate story in this world? That would actually be, I think, incredibly interesting to see, because I want to see what Magpie gets up to. I want to know more about her. She seems to be maybe an orphan of some kind. What happened to her family? How did she deal with all the things that were going on? Because we really didn't get to see her at all in any of the big things that happened in the entire trilogy. She kind of was there in the background. She was there as the cleanup crew. We don't really know much about her, but that epilogue leads me to believe that we will either get something like a novella or a separate novel like we did with Heartless that's going to involve this world again and seeing maybe some of my favorite characters again. But anyway, that is all I have to say about Supernova. I was so happy to finally finish this series and have the ability to say that this is my favorite trilogy I've ever read, because from book 1 to book 3, everything was so well done. The action scenes were great. The characters that you read from, Nova and Adrian, are some of the most interesting and complex characters I've ever read. And quite honestly, even the side characters were all entertaining in some capacity, whether I hated them so much because they were awful people, or I loved them so much that I wanted them to be my friends kind of thing. Like, there was nothing about this series that I feel like was really lacking that much. And like I said, this book really wraps up a lot of amazing things that I was not expecting to be wrapped up as well as it was, but I think is one of the most greatest payoffs when it comes to a final book in a series. So thank you all so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys.